All right, let's go ahead and start with some prayer. Okay. All right, Lord, thank you for this day. We always thank you for the week. It always brings certain trials, blessings, difficulties, challenges, but all those are to improve our character, to make us more like you. So we lift this time up for this section in Deuteronomy 7. We pray that your Holy Spirit would bring the word to us and that we'd be able to understand at least some depth of what is taught here in the Torah. So we thank you for these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so on to chapter 7. So let's read the first 5 verses and discuss those. So he says, when the Lord your God shall bring you into the land where you're entering to possess it, and shall clear away many nations before you, the Hivites and the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God shall deliver them before you, you shall defeat them, and then you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, and show no favor to them. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your own sons. For they will turn you and your sons away from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. Implication, out of the land. Verse 5, but thus you shall do to them. You shall tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, hew down their Asherim, and burn their graven images with fire. Okay. So these are the elements of what we could call the holy war that is beginning or soon to be waged by Israel in taking over this territory. Now there are, as you counted them there are 7 Canaanite nations. They are incredibly morally corrupt. They are idolatrous in their practices. We have evidence archaeologically of cannibalism, of child sacrifice, and constant fertility cult prostitution. That's the reference to Asherim in the verse. These cultures were extremely immoral, and you'll see in a moment why it is that God gets rid of them and says they need to be decimated, they need to be removed. Now, it's interesting, if you go back, if you hold your place in Deuteronomy here, but go back to Genesis and go to chapter 15. So go back there to Genesis 15. And you'll see some interesting things said. We're going to read verses 16 through 21. He says, then, now he's talking here to Abraham, and this is involving here the covenant with Abraham. Okay, he's just given the Abrahamic covenant. And he says, starting in verse 16, then in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. And it came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land. Okay? He says, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite, the Kenizzite, the Cadmonite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, and the Raphaim, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. So he includes even more nations here, but he includes certainly those 7 also that he's talked about. And notice the thing that's very interesting here, and that is what he says at the end of verse 16. For the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. In other words, he literally gives the Canaanite peoples 400 years to seek him and to repent. 400 years. And it's almost like in the Hebrew, it's almost like a jar that water is dripping into. And it drips and it drips for 400 years until finally that last drop swishes the water over the side. And at that point, the fate of the Canaanites in the land is done. That's where we're at right now. These 400 years have occurred. So it's not like God did not give them time. He did give them time. Now, he says that these 7 nations, of course, as I said, were allowed to live in Yahweh's property. You see what he's saying in the Abrahamic covenant? Who does he say owns the property?
God.
God. He's going to give it eventually to Abraham, but it isn't owned. But it's owned by the creator of the world, not really technically by the Canaanite peoples. As a matter of fact, look also, go back to our chapter in Deuteronomy 7, but turn to chapter 9. There's kind of another statement here that's interesting. Deuteronomy 9, verses 4 and 5. He says, do not say in your heart when the Lord your God has driven them out before you, because of my righteousness, the Lord has brought me in to possess the land. Now, the covenant was never based on their righteousness. It was based on God's righteousness and his promise to Abraham forever. That's the basis of it, okay? And then he says, but it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. See? They had their shot, but they didn't seek the Lord in any way. They've delved into further and further immorality and iniquity over those 400 years. Then he also says in verse 5 there in chapter 9, it is not for your righteousness or for the uprightness of your heart that you are going to possess the land, but it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God is driving them out before you in order to confirm the oath which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Okay? So that's the basis of where they are and why they're there. Now, it's interesting. People that read this and read this chapter and chapters like it frequently accuse God of being bloody, unfair, unjust. You know, how could he possibly ask for the complete extermination of these people? And this is often talked about. You know, this is why people often set up this idea, well, we don't believe in the God of the Old Testament, we believe in the God of the New Testament. Well, it's interesting because you see several examples that God did allow peoples that were not in the Commonwealth of Israel to come into the Commonwealth of Israel, but not these 7 nations. They were excluded. They had their 400-year shot, okay? An example of this, of course, is in Genesis 24. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but it's a story about how Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac, okay? And where do they send? Where does the servant go? He goes to the Aramean people, and she is picked from the Aramean people because they are not of the 7 nations. Therefore, it's legitimate to pick her to be the wife of Isaac and to come into the Commonwealth of Israel. Now, there's
why those 7 nations were excluded?
Because of what I just said, because they had such incredible wickedness. God gave them an opportunity to occupy that territory for 400 years, and then they proved that there was no repentance in them. I could go on and on about the archaeology that's found here, but if I talked about it extensively, we're practically going into a study of pornography. It's horrific what they did. Commonly, cannibalism and child sacrifice. They were wicked in their practice. And God said, your time's over, and I'm removing you from my piece of property here. Now, there is another example. There are other peoples that God is also allows into the commonwealth, and you'll find that if you hold your place in Deuteronomy 7 and you move over to chapter 20 of Deuteronomy, there's another example of exclusion here. Chapter 20.
Is this the Gibeonites?
No, that's in Joshua. It's not the Gibeonites. But yeah, they come into the commonwealth in a back door.
Yeah, but God allows it.
He allows it because they made an oath, and people are supposed to keep their oaths. We've already been over that in Deuteronomy so far. Now, starting in verse 12 of chapter 20, he says, however, he's talking about a city outside of Canaan. Okay, he says, however, if it does not make peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. When the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall strike it, and all the men with it at the edge of the sword. Only the women and the children and the animals and all that is in the city and all its spoil, you shall take as booty for yourself, and you shall use the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. Thus you shall do to all of these cities that are very far from you, you see, outside of the realm of these 7 Canaanite nations, which are not of the cities of these nations nearby. Only in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes. And then he says, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, Jebusite, again, these 7, as the Lord your God has commanded you, in order that they may not teach you to do according to all of their detestable things. There's the idea, detestable things, which they've done for their gods, so that you would sin against your Lord, your God. Okay, in other words, they are so corrupt and they're so morally polluted that the only choice God has is to rid the land of them. Okay? Now, so we see here that outside of these 7 nations, Israel can spare and intermarry with other cities, but not these 7 Canaanite nations. So this is not, therefore, a case of universal genocide. It's selective, and there's a reason for it. And there's time given for them to repent, but they don't take it. Now, it's interesting also that no intermarriage was allowed with the Canaanites because it would lead to predictable idol worship. Now, we see this repeated over and over and over and over in the Old Testament. Let's look at a classic example of it. Okay, there's 2 of them I want you to go to. Since you're already in Deuteronomy 20, it's not too far to go over Judges, which we studied not long ago. Chapter 3. And we're going to start in verse 5. And the sons of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. That is the very people they were supposed to destroy, which they didn't completely destroy. Okay, verse 6. And so they took their daughters for themselves as wives and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. Again, we've read exactly, prescriptively, what God told them not to do. Verse 7, and the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgot the Lord their God, and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. In other words, they became part of this fertility cult of Baal worship and Ashtaroth worship fully. That's what they did. And of course, verse 8, then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, so they sold them to the hands of, and then we talk about what's the Assyrians, is what's talked about next. So, another example of this, if you'll turn to 1 Kings, and this may be one of the most classic of all examples. It's the tragic story in 1 Kings 11, starting in verse 1. This is about Solomon, the man who was given the greatest wisdom of any man who had ever lived. But wisdom is not always obedience. Okay? And so here's what happened. This is a summary. Starting verse 1. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, that is, Egyptian. He also had Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittite women. Sidonians means the Phoenician area. Okay, this is where Ahaz gets his wonderful wife. Okay, Jezebel, she is from the Sidonian area. Verse 2, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, neither shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon held fast to these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For it came about when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. There's child sacrifice. Milcom, that's what they did. Okay. And Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not follow the Lord fully, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place to Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, and on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem for Moloch. This is the, of course, idol that they had outstretched arms. It was made of metal. In its belly was an open area where they would put wood and turn the idol red hot, and it had outstretched arms, and then they would take infants and lay them on their arms. This is Moloch worship, okay? He says, thus also he did for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. And they sacrificed people to their gods. And this is the level that Solomon came to at the end of his life, tragically, in spite of everything that God had done for him. So, now, notice this talk of holy war is not an Old Testament concept alone. It goes into the New Testament. Where? In Revelation 19. It's the ultimate holy war where Messiah comes back to the earth, and what does he do? He annihilates over a period of 200 miles all the armies that are staged against him. The blood is to the bridles of the horses. It's an immense. Matter of fact, it's a slaughter against these nations that are against him, that literally arm themselves against his return to the earth because they refuse, led by Antichrist, to let him take it back over again. It's probably the greatest single slaughter that's going to occur in any battle that's ever occurred. That's a holy war. The holy war ends the current regime of the nations on the earth, and then after it starts the reign of the king, Messiah, and of course what we call the millennial rule. But it ends with a massive holy war slaughter. Okay? So if one thinks this is only Old Testament, it is not. Go ahead, Jack.
During that time, then Satan will be locked up in the abyss, so he will not be present on the earth to influence people.
For 1,000 years. But then he's let go for a short period of time.
So the Messiah will have a 1,000-year reign then of the Messiah.
Yes.
So he won't have a satanic influence.
Correct.
That we have now.
That is true. It's not that the nature of man has changed, but the influence of Satan and temptation will be dramatically altered because he'll be locked up. So, yes, absolutely. Now, let's talk for a moment about what the spiritual application of this is to us as we look at the New Testament. What is the holy war? Well, there's a term for it that has been used by theologians. It's called the mortification of the flesh. and I want to talk about the mortification of the flesh. If you would have lived in the 1680s, if you would have lived in the 1740s during the time of Wesley, if you would have lived in the time of the late 1700s and early 1800s and some of the great preachers of America and England, you would have constantly heard them talk about the mortification of the flesh. It's hardly ever talked about in churches today. What's the last time you heard it talked about? And yet it's central to the process of sanctification. So let's look at it in the New Testament. Let's turn first to 2 Corinthians 4. And I'm just going to give you 4 or 5 or 6 passages. There are many more about it in Paul's epistles, but let's start with these to show you.
2 Thessalonians.
2 Corinthians 4. 2 Corinthians 4. And we're going to start, I think, in verse 7. Yes. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the surpassing greatness of the power may be of God and not from ourselves. In other words, there's this potential within each of us as saved people, but that the potential is not realized at the moment of salvation, but rather it's realized over the process of our life in this thing that we call sanctification. But how does Paul says, verse 8, we are afflicted in every way, but we're not crushed, perplexed, but not despairing, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. Here's the key, always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, the crucifixion principle, okay, the mortification of the flesh, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our own body. For we who are alive are constantly being delivered over to the death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death works in us, but life in you. That is mortification. It's putting to death the deeds of the flesh. In Galatians, he talks about it. He talks about the fruit of the Spirit and the fruit of the flesh. And he says that we have to put to death the deeds of the flesh. Okay? Let's look at another passage that talks about it. Let's go back to, let me see here. Now let's go forward to Galatians 2:20, since we're close to it. Galatians 2:20. Here's this very famous statement about mortification of the flesh. You've read it, I'm certain. Verse 20, I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and delivered himself up for me. Right? Death leads to life. That's the principle, the mortification. Turn to a couple, let's turn, since we're close, go to Colossians, go to your right, past Ephesians, Philippians to Colossians.
Girls eat pictures.
Yes, right. Or as one of my Bible teachers said, General Electric Power Company, JEPT. All right, go to Colossians 1, and we're going to look at verses 21 through 23. He says, now, although you were formerly alienated and hostile in mind, engaged in evil deeds, yet he now has reconciled you in his fleshly body through death, in order that to present you before him holy and blameless and beyond reproach, if indeed you continue in the faith firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under the heaven, and for which I, Paul, was made a minister. Okay? Again, the death to life principle, the mortification. Let's look at 2 classic passages in the book of Romans, chapter 6. Paul deals with this probably as in depth here as any place. So go to Romans 6. We'll turn and look first at verses 5 and 6 of Romans 6. Romans 6, starting verse 5. For if we have become united with him in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall be also in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him, and that our body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin. Drop down to verse 12. Therefore, notice carefully the grammar, do not let sin reign in your mortal body that you should obey its lusts. And do not go on presenting the members of your body to sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but rather present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. For sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. Mortification. Now, there's many, many passages about mortification. And yet, sadly, I don't see it being taught very much. Certainly in the progressive church, you're not going to ever hear it. Because you see, it would imply to them that there's something wrong with you, that you're not a good guy. Okay? All right? Well, the answer is the Bible is there's something wrong with you. It's called sin. It's a problem. Now, you're not going to be judged by it in the ultimate sense because the moral debt has been paid by Christ's death, right? But you still got a sin problem. We've still got a sin problem. It still is in our bodies, in our flesh, and we tend to act it out quite easily. Now, there's a very interesting book that I would love for you if you had time to read. It's a classic in Christian literature. It's a book written by John Bunyan. It was written in, it was written in 1682. It's an allegorical novel called The Holy War. And it's a brilliant illustration by Bunyan of this whole principle of the problem with needing to mortify our flesh. Let me tell you a little bit about it. If you go on the internet, you can get it on Amazon. You can get the original version. You can get a more up-to-date, English-friendlier version, okay, because obviously it originally is in Old English, okay? It's an absolutely classic book. It was actually one of the greatest sellers that he had. It was, by the way, Bunyan was spent, I think it was 12 years of his life imprisoned for his Christian Protestant belief. And in that place, he wrote, I believe he wrote both Pilgrim's Progress and also The Holy War while he was in prison. As a matter of fact, at one point, as he was writing during these 12 years, these classics, they said to him, if you'll come out and not preach your horrible Protestant teaching, we'll let you out of prison. And he said, keep me in prison because I cannot deny that which I know. And he wrote more. Bunyan was a character. He was a very great saint. And so here's what it's about. It's about this city where these three esteemed men who, by admitting Diablos into the city, lost their previous authority. They were called Understanding, who was the mayor of the city, who ends up being hidden from light, his light and understanding because of it. There was another mayor called Conscience, who was the recorder, who became, quote, a madman, at times sinning at great length and other times condemning sin at the same time. And there was also a character named Lord Will, okay, whose desire has been completely changed from serving the true Lord to serving Diablos, okay? The city is called the city of Mansoul. And of course, it was created by this person called Shaddai. I don't think there's any question about who he is, the sovereign of the universe, okay? And of course, salvation to the city came from this person named Emmanuel, who was the son of Shaddai. Jesus, the Messiah. There's also in this story a person called the secretary, who's one who is equal to Shaddai and Emmanuel, who resides in man's soul after his victorious conquest by Emmanuel. Of course, the famous negative personality is Diablos, the deceiver whose crafty lies prompted the fall of man's soul after it was liberated, and who holds the city against the conquest by Emmanuel. Now, there's also some interesting mayors who are installed by Diablos in the city of Mansoul. One is called Lusting. He's a mayor of Diablo of the city.
I love his term.
That's right,
Makes it
Lusting.
easy, doesn't it?
There's one called Forget the Good. He's another mayor of the town. He's the recorder under Diablos, who completely despises the law of Shaddai. Okay, there's another mayor called Conviction. I'm sorry. Then Emmanuel brings his mayors to also reign in the city to try to bring it back under the authority of El Shaddai. And of course, he brings in first his first captain is called Conviction, Emmanuel's. His second is called Judgment. His third is called Execution. His fourth is called Credence. His fifth captain is called Good Hope. His seventh captain is called Charity. His eighth captain is called Innocence, and his ninth captain is called Patience. They all live under this problem of what's called carnal security, the entrapping nature of Diablos in the city. So the story goes on, and it's a very creative and interesting way in which, in an allegory, Bunyan shows the problem of having been freed from sin, but then being enslaved back into it. Diablos takes back over and has his people in it to do his will. So it's a very interesting story, and if you ever get time, I really think it would be worth your while to read it.
That's what the Judaizers did, tried to
Absolutely.
pull them back into Judaism.
Now let's turn back to Deuteronomy 7. And let's read now verses 6 to 11. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession, out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any of the peoples around you, for you were actually the fewest of all the peoples. But because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your forefathers, the Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God, who keeps his covenant and his loving kindness to the 2000th generation. That means forever, okay? With those who love him and keep his commandments, but repays those who hate him to his face to destroy them. He will not delay with him who hates him. He will repay him to his face. Therefore you shall keep the commandment and the statutes and the judgments which I'm commanding you today to do them. Okay. Now, Israel was to act daily in a manner that showed Yahweh's character. And in that sense, they demonstrated that they were a holy people. Okay? That is, they were to set aside the practices of the evil Canaanites. They were chosen not on their own merit, but rather they were chosen because God chose them and chose to make an oath to their father Abraham. As a matter of fact, he says they're not a mighty people. Abraham, of course, came with a few family members from Ur into the area of the Levant. As a matter of fact, all the way till Jacob's time, when the house of Jacob came because of famine into Egypt, there still were only 70 of them. That was the totality of Israel at that point. Now, once they were in Egypt for, we don't know exactly how long, maybe 100 years, maybe 200 years, we don't know. They were not enslaved initially. They lived in Goshen and they thrived and they thrived and they thrived at that time. And that's the place where God turned them into a great nation. But ultimately, they became enslaved because they became so numerous and Pharaoh saw them as a threat, right? Okay. It's interesting. Keep your hand here in Deuteronomy 7, but turn back to the minor quote prophets to Hosea. He is right after the book of Daniel, I believe. Yeah, Hosea. And I want you to look at chapter 2 of Hosea. And I want to read verses 19 and 20. Hosea 2, verses 19 and 20. I will betroth you to me forever, says the Lord. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and justice, in loving kindness and in compassion, and I will betroth you to me in faithfulness. Then you will know, then you will know the Lord. So again, he views his relationship with Israel as a marriage, and he sees Israel as his wife in that sense. We also see, you don't have to turn here, but I'll turn here. I'm going to turn to the book of Hebrews, chapter 6. And I want to read several verses that endorse the same concept. Hebrews, chapter 6. And I'm going to read starting verse 13. For when God made the promise to Abraham, since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself. Right? Who greater could God swear to than himself, the ultimate, all-existent one of the universe, saying, I surely shall bless you, and I surely shall multiply you. And thus, having patiently waited, he obtained the promise. For men swear by one greater than themselves, and with them an oath given as confirmation is an end of every dispute. In the same way, God, desiring even more to show to the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose, interposed with an oath. That is, his promises were the elements of his oath. In order that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, that is, the person that he is and the oath he gives, okay? Those two unchangeable things. We may have strong encouragement, we who have fled for refuge in laying hold of the hope set before us. That's a New Testament way to say exactly what is said there in Deuteronomy. Now, Yahweh, of course, is the unique one of the universe who controls history, who raises nations, and who will bless those who follow him in perpetuity, forever, 1,000 generations. On the flip side, in these verses, we see that he also repays those who oppose him, and he destroys those nations that go against him, that is, hate him to his face. Those who are arrogant and bold and rebellious, not unlike the men of Sodom. And I won't turn here, but there's an interesting statement by them and their distinct opposition to the Lord as they state it in Genesis 13:13. Now, notice the constant reiteration. Follow the Lord, follow his commandments, follow his statutes. You may ask yourself, why does he keep saying this? Well, think of it this way. When you were raising your own children, how many times did you say, pick up their shoes, put them in the right place, clean your room, put that back where it's supposed to be in the right place in the room? Okay, pick up your toys, put them in the toy chest. How many times did you say it? Over and over and over until hopefully one day it imprints in them and they finally get the message.
Yeah, right.
And this is exactly what is going on here. He's trying to imprint because he knows nature and instinct inside human beings. So he has to say it again and again and again. Now let's read back in chapter 7 of Deuteronomy. Let's read now verses 12 through 16. Then it shall come about, because you listen to these judgments and keep and do them, that the Lord your God will keep you in his covenant and his loving kindness with which he swore to your forefathers. And he will love you, and he will bless you, and he will multiply you. He will also bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of the ground, your grain and your new wine and your oil, in the increase of your herd and the young of your flock, in the land which he swore to your forefathers to give you. You shall be blessed above all peoples. There shall be no male or female barren among you or among your cattle. And the Lord your God will remove from you all sickness, and he will not put on you any of the harmful diseases of Egypt, which you have known, but he will lay them on all who hate you. And you shall consume all the peoples whom the Lord your God will deliver to you. Your eyes shall not pity them, neither shall you serve their gods, for that would be a snare to you. Now, she says some interesting things here. They're conditional, though, right? His promise to them and his oath to Abraham is not conditional, it's unconditional. But these blessings that he's talking about are conditional, and they're based on their obedience. If they obey, they will increase in fertility. Their animals will increase in fertility, and they'll become more numerous. They will have agricultural success with wine and grapes and grains and olive oil. He mentions those three elements. Okay. They will have increased goods. And I guess one author, theologian, put it this way: it is good for our bodies to mortify our fleshly souls. It's a good quote. It is good for our bodies to mortify our fleshly souls. Obedience will also include protection or immunity from certain diseases, that is, from the diseases that the Canaanite peoples had and bothered them and infected them. He says if they obey, they won't get those diseases, nor will they get any of the diseases they were familiar with that occurred frequently in Egypt. So they'll be exempt from all these things. It's interesting. But they must clear the land and not practice idolatry. Those are the two things that they are commanded. Remember, in the Old Testament, infertility, called barrenness, was considered a reproach and an embarrassment. We're reminded, of course, of Elizabeth, who became the father of John, the mother of John the Baptist. She was not able for a period of time to be fertile, and she again talks about that God lifted the reproach against her, and of course John therefore was conceived. Now, let's go to verses 17 through 21 of chapter 7, Deuteronomy. If you should say in your heart, these nations are greater than I, how can I dispossess them? You shall not be afraid of them. You shall well remember that what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and all of Egypt, the great trials with which your eyes saw, and the signs and the wonders and the mighty hand of the outstretched arm by which the Lord your God brought you out. So shall the Lord your God do to all the peoples of whom you are afraid. Moreover, the Lord your God will send the hornet against them, until those who are left and hide themselves from you shall perish. Okay, and then I think we're going to go to verse 21 also. You shall not dread them, for the Lord your God is in your midst, a great and awesome God. Okay? Now, what he's saying is the natural tendency to fear which one sees. Remember, we can go all the way back to Numbers 13, where they see the Anakim in the land. They see the offspring of the Nephilim, and they say we're grasshoppers in their sight. And of course, the 12 spies refuse to give a good report to Israel. Only the two, Caleb and Joshua, do. Why? Because they see the size of these giants and they say, we can't do it. Well, here God is saying, don't worry about their numbers. Don't worry about their size. Don't worry about their appearance. And why? Because he says, number one, remember your history. I took you out against probably the greatest army that had amassed itself in Egypt by Pharaoh during that time, and I defeated all of it for you, leading you literally by your hand through mighty 10 obviously miracles of the plagues against Egypt, and then, of course, drowning the army of Pharaoh in the Red Sea. By the way, they found even more elements of the Egyptian army in the Red Sea recently, archaeologically, more chariot wheels and other elements of armor that, of course, were known to be traditional of the Egyptian army. You know, that place is becoming a interesting archaeological burial ground where we'll find the truth of what's being said right here in these words.
Yes.
Okay? Now, he says also that we are not to focus beyond today's task. In other words, don't look at the totality of what needs to be done. Remember Jesus' words about this in Matthew 6. Each day has enough trouble of its own. The soldier was not to look at the total numbers of these 7 nations. He was simply to do what he was called to do that day. And God assured the outcome as a result. Now he talks about the hornet. Now the hornet may have been literal because we have archaeological records by clay tablets and writings of these very large hornets that actually lived in clefts and rocks in this area of the Levant. As a matter of fact, in writings about them, their sting was not only serious but often lethal. They were big, apparently, like a big size. That could be, and probably was part of what he meant, but there's another part he meant about being the hornet, and that's the supernatural element. That is, God put the fear and panic of them on these nations as they went in to conquer them. Turn from Deuteronomy to the book of Joshua. Let's look at Joshua chapter 2 first, just to your right. You remember when we studied the book of Joshua, this is, of course, what Rahab says, starting in verse 9 of chapter 2 of Joshua. And she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us. The terror. That all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. Here's 7 nations of people occupying this area of the Levant, and they're scared to death of Israel. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you as you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And when we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven and on the earth. It's quite a proclamation from a woman who was a Canaanite, but who repented and who became a part of the Commonwealth of Israel, and who, interestingly, as we know, and her descendants became in the very lineage of Christ himself.
Yeah.
And she says clearly, hey, I live in this town, Jericho, and they're scared to death of you. Okay? They've heard about you. In Joshua 24, turn to the last chapter of Joshua, a very similar thing is said by Joshua. He recounts their history also, starting in verse 11 of Joshua 24. He says, and you crossed the Jordan and came into Jericho. Now, this is their future. This is what's going to happen. We're reading in Deuteronomy as they're being prepared for this. Now it's happened, okay? And he says, and the citizens of Jericho fought against you, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Canaanite, the Hivite, the Girgashite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Thus I gave them all into your hand, and I sent the hornet before you, and it drove out the 2 kings of the Amorites before you, but not by your sword or by your bow. And I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities in which you had not built, and you have lived in them, and you're eating of the vineyards and the olive grove which you did not plant. Verse 14, now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river, that is the Euphrates, and also in Egypt. Serve the Lord only. So here's another reminder of the fear of the Lord that's put in them. In other words, God has his own supernatural plan. Okay, and he's going to enact it. He's the one ultimately that will eliminate the Canaanites from the land. Now, back in Deuteronomy 7, let's finish it up, starting in verse 22 to 26. And the Lord your God will clear away these nations before you little by little. You will not be able to put an end to them quickly, lest the wild beasts grow too numerous for you. But the Lord your God shall deliver them before you, and will throw them into great confusion until they're destroyed. There you see the very thing about the hornet. And he will deliver their kings, and he will deliver their kings into your hands, so that you will make their name perish from under heaven. No man will be able to stand before you until you have destroyed them. The graven images of their gods you are to burn with fire, and you shall not covet the silver or the gold that is on them, nor take it for yourselves, lest you be ensnared by it, for it's an abomination of the Lord. And you shall not bring any abomination into your house, and it like it come under, for it shall be under the ban. You shall utterly detest it, you shall utterly abhor it, and it is something that is banned. Okay, now the Lord's plan is strategic. He defeated his enemies at a rate in which Israel could therefore inhabit the territory. He didn't intend for it to become a vacuum. Why? Because if it did, then the vineyards would have gone bad. The agricultural land would have gone fallow again. They wouldn't have had the richness of the land if they had done it all at once, because they couldn't have inhabited then. So they do it by stages, stage by stage. As a matter of fact, you can see, you don't have to turn here, but in Joshua 12, verse 9, he talks about these 7 nations of the Canaanites, which include 31 kings. That's what you read in Joshua 12:9. And now these kings, of course, were destroyed by Joshua. Not one of them was spared. Joshua did what he was supposed to do. Interestingly enough, there were other people who didn't do what they were supposed to do. An example of that, of course, is of Saul. Turn to 1 Samuel 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15. We're going to start in verse 8. This is a second time, major time in which Saul disobeys the Lord. Starting verse 8. And he captured Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, all that was good, and they were not willing to destroy them utterly. That is, Agag was of the Amalekites. He was a Canaanite. He was not to be spared. And it says, but everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I regret that I made you Saul, the king, for he turned back from following me and has not carried out my commands. And Saul was distressed and cried out to the Lord all night. Okay? So, exactly. So what happens? Here we have the disobedience of Saul in 1 Samuel. Because he allows Agag to live, Agag has sons, and we read in Esther. Well, let's turn there since you're close. Turn over to the book of Esther. We should be familiar with this since we just taught Esther. After Ezra, Nehemiah's Esther is Esther. Let's go to chapter 3, I think, verse 1. Esther 3:1. After these events, Xerxes promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him over and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. He is the offspring of King Agag that Saul would not kill. So what happens? He spares him, and what does he end up doing to his own people? He ends up allowing a person to be born, Haman, who is of the offspring of Agag, who ends up trying to promote the greatest, probably the greatest genocide in the Jews that has ever occurred on the face of the earth. 15 million of them living in the Persian Empire. Why? Because he didn't do what God told him to do. And God knows the consequence. He sees the generations are going to happen if they don't do it. But when they don't do it, it happens. Okay? God knows the forward from the backward, the future from from history, and therefore defying him is foolishness. Now, also by destroying the 31 kings that were in the Canaanite territory, they destroy also all the enemy leadership. Therefore, there's no way for the Canaanites to organize themselves well. Now, notice it says here that all the idols were to be broken and burnt, and no one was to try to capture any silver or gold off of them, any covering of silver and gold from them. It was also to be destroyed, not to be retained. We have an example, of course, of that not being true, where they defy the Lord in this. It's found in Joshua chapter 7, the sin of Achan. I'll turn there and I'll read that portion to you.
He had it in his tent.
Yep. Joshua 7. Remember the story, the extent that God goes to seek out the disobedience of having these idols in the silver and gold. He literally lines up all of Israel, goes through family groups by lot, until finally it comes to Achan's family group, and finally Achan is identified. And look what occurs starting in verse 16 of Joshua 7. He says, it came about at the seventh time, that is the seventh lot. Then the priest blew the trumpets. Joshua said to them, I'm sorry, I'm just reading 6. Ha! Didn't go to 7. Sorry. So Joshua rose early in the morning and brought Israel near by tribes. And the tribe of Judah was taken, and he brought the family of Judah near, and he took them by the family of Zerites, and brought the family of the Zerites near, man by man, and Zabdi was taken, and he brought him and his household near, man by man, and Achan, the son of Carmi, and the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah, from the tribe of Judah, was taken. So God does a supernatural picking to identify this one guy in 2 million Jews, okay, who did this. Then Joshua said to Achan, my son, I implore you, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and give praise to him, and tell me now what you've done. Don't hide it. And Achan answered Joshua and says, I have sinned against the Lord and the God of Israel, and this is what I did. When I saw among the spoil of the beautiful mantle from Shinar and 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold and 50 shekels in weight, then I coveted it, took it for them, and behold, they are concealed in the earth under my tent with the silver underneath it. So here's an example of the very thing that they're told not to do, they end up eventually doing.
Question.
Yes.
So God already knew, right, who did this.
Yes.
So what was the purpose of all this?
To illustrate in a great, grand illustration the futility of disobeying the Lord. It's like spreading the troops out at muster and going through every one of them by troop, by brigade, and by all this, and finally it comes down to the one guy. In other words, it was a great, grand illustration for Israel. This is what happens if you do this. Okay?
And you cannot hide from God.
And you cannot hide from God.
No, you can't escape.
You can't escape. Now, remember, idols, again, that were found here were mostly and overwhelmingly pornographic in nature. They were pornographic images. which of course encouraged sexual immorality. Also, household idols were often amulets that were connected to magic, incantations, and the occult,
Evil spirit.
evil spirits, demons. So if they kept those in their house, then they're opening up their own household to the occult by doing it. That's why they were to be
Indians kept a lot of amulets.
lots of people. The Babylonians had more amulets than Carter has pills. I mean, the Babylonian culture was riddled with amulets, incantations, magic, spells, curses. They were in constant fear of their neighbors putting curses on them. Okay, I mean, it's interesting reading their literature about these things. So that is the seventh
But
chapter.
it's still common in many.
Of course it
cultures,
is.
In many cultures.
In many cultures.
Amulets and everything.
One of the ones that is horrific is in
Mexican,
is in India.
email.
The amount of occult goes on there is unbelievable in India. You know, when you talk to the pastors in India about what goes on, they're constantly riddled with demons.
Haiti,
Haiti is bad also. There are many countries like it. So,
Caribbeans.
all right. So that's the seventh chapter of Deuteronomy. We're moving along. Okay? So why don't you any questions, comments, anything? Okay.
I have a question, Tim.